If you grew up in the deep Utah desert, you heard plenty of stories about God. But out in the scrub brush, huddled around a fire, older women passed down a very specific, terrifying kind of folklore about the adversary. The warning was simple, but it stuck with you. Never, ever sleep with your mouth open. To the faithful, a parted jaw in the dark was an open invitation. It was how the familiars creeping through the red rock tested the pure bloodlines of the settlement. Which brings us to Salt Lake City in the summer of 1868. Jane Carrington Young was 28 years old. She was devout, obedient, and completely exhausted. On a suffocatingly hot, still night, she finally managed to fall asleep, and her jaw went slack. She woke in the dark to the dry, sandpaper rasp of scales sliding over her tongue. Before she could scream, she was gagging. Something cold and living was frantically working its way down her throat. Jane belonged to pioneer royalty. She was the daughter of a high-ranking church leader and sealed in marriage to an apostle. She lived at the dead center of absolute priesthood power. Yet, as this creature breached her body, she was structurally entirely alone. Swallowing that creature in 1868 marked the start of a 15-year nightmare. For Jane, the crushing, unspoken pressures of her daily life had finally found a physical form. That same year, Jane's husband was elevated to the Quorum of the 12, the highest governing body of the church. This promotion meant he was suddenly and permanently absent, sent out on colonization missions and divine errands across the territory. Jane became the human infrastructure left behind. As a plural wife, she was tasked with managing the farm, raising the children, and absorbing the brutal physical labor required to keep the homestead running, all while sharing a husband she rarely saw. She carried this weight in total silence. The doctrine of the times strictly forbade complaining. Any display of anger, exhaustion, or despair was treated as a direct rebellion against God's plan. Looking at this diagram, folklore described the creature settling deep in her stomach, the familiar nested beneath her ribs. When Jane gave every ounce of energy to the farm, leaving her stomach empty, the lizard would strike. She reported violent gnawing on her left side. Because the strict pioneer culture demanded a perfectly sweet demeanor, Jane had no vocabulary for her own exhaustion. The biting pain of the lizard became her body's only permitted way to scream. Jane was forced to live a split existence. By day, she maintained the cheerful facade required of a church leader's wife. By night, she lay awake in bed, being actively consumed from the inside out. The physical pain was terrible, but the psychological toll was worse. In the dead quiet of her bedroom, Jane could hear a soft, wet lapping sound echoing up her throat. The adversary was actively drinking her blood. She tried to starve it out, fasting for days at a time. She called in the elders and performed priesthood blessings, hoping a surge of faith would drive the demonic intrusion away. As seen on this illustrated clipboard, Jane diagnosed her suffering using 19th century logic. A normal pioneer stomachache was dull and continuous. This pain had targeted movements and reacted to her fasting. It left no doubt she was hosting a familiar. For 15 years, that creature thrived inside her. It acted as a dark, symbiotic companion, feeding directly on the exact same life force that the settlement and the pioneer economy extracted from her every single day. Finally, in the late summer of 1883, the pain became entirely unbearable. The local Salt Lake doctors realized that fasting and prayer were failing. They turned instead to brutal 19th century heroic medicine. They gave her calomel, a highly toxic mercury compound, along with raw eggs and harsh mustard water. It was an agonizing trial of the flesh, a violent chemical assault on her system, meant to purge the sickness. The medicine triggered an agonizing, retching purge. She vomited repeatedly into a basin until the creature was finally expelled. The harsh chemicals had broken it into pieces, but the doctors noted its form was perfectly traceable. It was a lizard. The doctors collected those fragments and preserved them in 2 glass bottles of alcohol. Almost immediately, the bottles were put on public display, a medical marvel to the town, and a spiritual trophy for the men who believed they had defeated the adversary. Her husband eventually returned from his travels to praise God for her deliverance. But as Jane looked at those 2 glass bottles sitting on the shelf, the celebration felt hollow. The lizard was dead, but her reality remained untouched. The men would still leave on their missions. The young daughters would still be brokered into sealings to consolidate power. The crushing weight of the bloodline remained entirely intact. Jane realized a terrible truth. The lizard was never a foreign invader. It simply occupied a space that the pioneer system had deliberately hollowed out. In a strange way, that creature was the only entity that had ever truly acknowledged her pain. That structural isolation outlived the pioneer era. It echoes into the present day, passed down through tightly wound braids and forced quiet smiles around isolated campfires. The wake of those early colonizers never truly dissipated. It simply shifted forms, waiting in the dark for the next fateful, exhausted vessel to close her eyes and open her mouth.